When the doors of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant swung open, even the chandeliers seemed to tremble, because the man who walked in had the power to ruin lives with a single glance. The crystal chandeliers above the golden terrace glowed like molten fire, their light bouncing across marble floors polished to a mirror's sheen. Every detail of the restaurant shimmered with wealth, gold leaf trim on the columns, velvet banquettes that looked as though no mortal had dared sit on them, and hushed conversations spoken over wine that cost more than a working man's rent. It was a place where power dined, where reputations were made or shattered depending on the placement of a single smile. Tonight, however, every whisper died when the mahogany doors opened. The air seemed to chill with the sound, and the clink of cutlery paused in midair as if the entire room recognized the shift in atmosphere. Oliver Montague had arrived. The waiters knew the stories. Sophia Chen, the manager, had perfected the art of serene professionalism, her hair pulled tight into a sleek bun, her black suit crisp and commanding. Yet even she felt her pulse spike whenever the youngest billionaire in Manhattan walked through those doors. He was unpredictable, demanding, and ruthless with details others wouldn't notice. Sophia kept her face neutral, though a storm swirled inside her chest. She had seen employees crumble under that man's gaze. Javier stood near the wine cellar door, clutching a tray that shook faintly in his hands. He had been working at the Golden Terrace for a decade, and no guest had ever shaken him, until Oliver Montague. Months ago, he'd brought the man a $500 vintage Bordeaux, its temperature off by no more than 2 degrees. Oliver had sent it back with a flick of his wrist and a cutting remark that left Javier feeling as though his entire career had been rendered meaningless. Once then, Javier had developed a habit of disappearing into the shadows whenever the Ice King appeared. Tonight was no exception. And then there was Mia. Sweet, timid Mia. She hadn't lasted a month. One sharp comment from Oliver, delivered in that low, glacial tone, and she had fled mid-shift, tears streaking her face as she ripped off her apron. No one had blamed her. They had merely nodded in quiet understanding. Now, as Oliver's tall figure strode across the dining room, his presence cut through the air like a blade. The tailored black suit fit him with military precision, every line sharp and deliberate, his cufflinks catching the golden light like sparks. His dark hair was immovable, his expression carved from marble. Conversations faltered. Waiters vanished behind curtains, suddenly remembering tables that needed polishing, glasses that needed filling. But Emma Sinclair didn't have the luxury of hiding. She smoothed down her apron with trembling fingers, her chestnut hair refusing to stay neatly in its ponytail. Today was her first shift at the Golden Terrace. Her stomach had been in knots since she arrived, nerves prickling every time she stepped onto the glittering floor. She had survived diners and greasy spoon coffee shops, but nothing like this place. Rent loomed. Her grandmother's medications weren't going to pay for themselves. She needed this job. Failure was not an option. Sophia's voice brushed her ear like a commandment. Table 12, Mr. Montague. The words were clipped, tinged with pity. I know it's your first night, but I need you to serve him. Emma's green eyes flickered across the room toward the corner booth. Oliver Montague had already claimed it, his posture immaculate, his focus glued to his phone. Fingers moved with swift precision over the screen, closing deals worth millions, no doubt. He didn't glance up, didn't acknowledge the hush that fell around him. He was the storm, and everyone else were leaves caught in his wake. Emma inhaled slowly, steadying the fire in her chest. Fear prickled her spine, but determination burned brighter. She squared her shoulders and walked across the marble floor, the soft jazz trembling beneath her footsteps. Each step carried her closer to the man who made seasoned staff crumble. Good evening, she said, voice even, carrying just enough warmth to mask her nerves. I'm Emma, and I'll be your server tonight. Can I start you with something to drink? Without looking up, Oliver spoke in a tone that was both a command and dismissal. Water. Room temperature. No ice, no lemon. Bring it in a wine glass, not a water glass. The words were exact, calculated, as though she were a machine to be programmed. Emma blinked at his audacity but held her ground. Of course, she said smoothly, allowing just a flicker of dry humor to color her voice. Anything else while I'm getting your water? Oliver's fingers stilled, his gaze lifted, and for the first time those arctic gray eyes locked on hers. A flicker of something unreadable, curiosity, surprise, maybe even irritation, passed across his perfectly controlled features. The chandeliers still shimmered like captured starlight, but Emma barely noticed them anymore. Her heart was beating so loudly she could hear it in her ears as she set Oliver Montague's wine glass of water on the table with steady hands. The billionaire's gray eyes flickered over her movements, sharp as a hawk's, though his expression betrayed nothing. Around the room, staff pretended to be busy polishing cutlery or rearranging vases of roses, yet their eyes never strayed far from table 12. It wasn't curiosity, it was survival instinct. Everyone was waiting for the storm. Oliver picked up the glass, inspected it, as though it were a rare diamond, and then took a sip. "Acceptable," he murmured, setting it back down with the precision of a surgeon placing an instrument. Relief rippled silently through the restaurant like a wave, though Emma didn't let herself breathe it in. Instead, she stayed standing there, pen poised above her notepad, her gaze steady on the man whose reputation had sent servers fleeing for the exits. "What would you like for dinner tonight, Mr. Montague?" she asked, her tone crisp but not deferential. She expected the usual curt order, another impossible list of specifications. Instead, his eyes lingered on her face, studying her the way one might examine a puzzle piece that refused to fit. "You're new." His voice was low, but it carried. Conversations from nearby tables faltered. A woman in pearls actually set down her fork, as if this exchange might be worth watching. "Brand new," Emma admitted. She straightened her spine, refusing to let her nerves betray her. "Fresh out of diners and coffee shops." "Most people," Oliver said slowly, leaning back against the leather booth, "are careful around me." The words were not boastful, merely factual. It was the truth of his existence. The wealthy feared offending him, the staff feared displeasing him, and his peers in boardrooms feared being crushed by him. Emma tilted her head, her ponytail sliding over one shoulder. "Most people probably think you're more important than you actually are." The silence that followed was so sharp it could have cut glass. A fork clattered to the floor across the dining room. Sophia, watching from the bar, closed her eyes in horror. Javier muttered a prayer under his breath from his post by the cellar. No one spoke to Oliver Montague like that. And then, impossibly, he laughed. The sound burst out of him, rich and unexpected, like sunlight cracking through storm clouds. Heads swiveled, jaws dropped. Oliver Montague, the Ice King of Manhattan, was laughing in the middle of the Golden Terrace. The sound was so foreign, even his own bodyguards by the entrance exchanged bewildered glances. Emma blinked, thrown off balance. She hadn't expected amusement, anger, yes, maybe even dismissal, but not laughter. "You," Oliver said, the corner of his mouth curving, "are not like the others." "I'll take that as a compliment." She tucked her pen behind her ear. "Now dinner? Seafood risotto, no mushrooms, extra saffron. And tell the chef if it's overcooked even slightly, I'll send it back." His smile faded as quickly as it had come, the mask sliding neatly back into place. But something lingered in his eyes, a curiosity that refused to vanish. Emma scribbled the order, but her pulse quickened. She'd pushed him. He'd laughed. And in that laugh, she sensed a crack in the ice. As she turned away, she caught the whispers darting like minnows across the room. "Did you hear that?" He laughed. She made him laugh. Back near the bar, Sophia's polished mask finally cracked, just for an instant. She watched Emma stride to the kitchen, and for the first time in years, the manager felt something dangerous stirring beneath the restaurant's golden glow. Hope. Oliver Montague swirled his glass of water, staring after the new waitress as though she'd taken something from him he hadn't realized he'd been missing. For the first time in longer than he could remember, dinner suddenly seemed interesting. And somewhere deep inside, the storm began to shift. The Golden Terrace never felt the same after that night. Word spread among the staff like wildfire. Emma Sinclair, the rookie waitress from Queens, had done the impossible. She had spoken back to Oliver Montague, survived the encounter, and most shocking of all, she had made him laugh. It was as though a myth had been broken, or rewritten entirely. But Emma herself barely had time to process what she had done. She still worked double shifts, still carried trays that weighed too much, still took the subway home to a broken elevator and an apartment where her grandmother waited with knitting needles and warm advice. Yet every evening at precisely 8 o'clock, Oliver Montague arrived at table 12, like clockwork. The waiters began to dread, and at the same time anticipate, those nights. Javier, who had once hidden in the cellar whenever Oliver appeared, now lingered nearby with poorly disguised fascination. He muttered to Sophia, "Watch this, he'll ignore everyone else, but when she comes near he actually looks human." Sophia, polished and efficient as always, didn't reply, but the way her eyes flickered toward Emma told the truth. She had noticed too. It wasn't just that Oliver ordered complicated meals, though he still did, testing the chef with precision. It wasn't that his suits looked as if they'd been spun from shadows and starlight, though they did. It was the way he leaned back in his booth, his phone set aside more often than not, and waited for Emma to come talk to him. The Ice King, the storm that once sent servers scattering, now seemed tethered to one person, a waitress who had no patience for his arrogance. Emma herself felt the shift, but didn't dare speak it aloud. She served him as she would any customer, efficiently, politely, with just a touch of her own dry wit. But the conversations began to stretch. At first it was small talk. She asked him if he ever actually enjoyed the food here, or if it was all just a test of perfection. His lips twitched. Enjoyment is overrated, perfection lasts. Spoken like a man who's never had diner pie at 3 a.m., she retorted, making Javier nearly drop a tray when he overheard. But then the talk deepened. Oliver confessed, quietly, almost as if to himself, that he couldn't remember the last time he'd had a real conversation with someone who wasn't angling for his money or his power. Emma, drying her hands on her apron, shrugged. That's because you've built walls so high even you can't see over them. That struck him harder than any insult could have. He stared at her then, truly stared, as though no one had ever dared map the architecture of his loneliness. Suspense grew like pressure in the room. The staff whispered about it in the storage closet, in the break room, even during smoke breaks in the alley. He's going to destroy her, Mia, who had quit, said when she came back for her last paycheck. You don't poke storms, they swallow you whole. But Javier disagreed. No, watch her. She's not bending. Maybe she's the only one who can. One night, after hours of easy banter, Oliver broke the rhythm with something that sent a shiver through Emma. Tell me about your grandmother, he said suddenly. Emma froze, her hands tightening around the notepad she wasn't even using. Why? Because you mentioned her once, Oliver said, voice steady but softer than she had ever heard it. And it wasn't small talk. It mattered to you. And I want to know what matters to you. The request was so startling, so intimate in its simplicity, that Emma's guard cracked. She told him about Rosa, her stubborn resilience, her old-world sayings, her endless knitting projects that filled the apartment with warmth. She even mentioned the medication bills that gnawed at her paycheck. Halfway through her confession, Emma realized what she was doing, sharing her heart with a man she should fear, and shut her mouth. But Oliver didn't mock her. He didn't brush it aside. Instead, his eyes darkened with something that looked almost like pain. I know what it's like, he murmured, to watch someone you love need something you can't afford, to feel powerless. Emma blinked. For a moment, the storm inside him wasn't ice, it was memory, raw and jagged. But before she could ask, he straightened, the walls sliding back into place. Bring me the check, he said briskly. She turned away, unsettled, and only later noticed the folded bills he left on the table, a tip so large it made her knees weak. Back at the bar, Sophia picked up the billfold and studied the zeros, her lips pressed thin. He's changing, she whispered to Javier. No, Javier replied, eyes on Emma as she walked away, unaware of Oliver watching her go. She's changing him. And in the quiet golden light of the golden terrace, a dangerous truth began to take root. The Ice King wasn't melting, he was cracking. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks earlier, tucked inside a cream-colored envelope embossed with gold. At first, Emma thought it was a mistake, the kind of thing that belonged in a penthouse mailbox and not outside a cramped queen's apartment with peeling paint on the doorframe. But Oliver Montague never made mistakes. Charity Gala, Metropolitan Museum, black tie. Those words might as well have been written in another language. Emma stared at them in disbelief, the paper trembling in her hand. Rosa, knitting needles clicking in the background, raised an eyebrow. Looks like your Mr. Montague is dragging you into his world, mija. Question is, are you brave enough to walk there with your head high? Emma wasn't sure, but bravery had never been optional for her. The night of the gala, the Golden Terrace staff gossiped as though preparing for a storm. Javier muttered about how the Ice King never brought dates, how the press would devour any woman foolish enough to appear at his side. Sophia, arms folded, whispered a warning Emma would not forget. Those people don't eat dinner, they eat reputations. By the time Emma stepped into the Temple of Dendur, her heart was hammering so loudly she feared it would echo against the ancient stone walls. The emerald green silk dress Oliver had sent fit her like a secret whispered against her skin, flowing with each step. Diamond earrings glinted at her ears, so bright she almost feared to touch them. She felt like she was wearing someone else's life, an actress playing a role that didn't belong to her. But Oliver looked at her as though she belonged more than anyone else in the room. His hand rested lightly at the small of her back as he guided her through the crush of Manhattan's elite. The air smelled of perfume and old money. Waiters in white gloves floated by with champagne flutes, though Emma's throat was too tight to drink. You look stunning, Oliver murmured, and there was no performative arrogance in his tone, only sincerity. I feel like a fraud, she whispered back, watching women in couture gowns air kiss with practiced indifference. You look more real than all of them combined, he said, his eyes lingering on her with a softness that made the crowd blur. But then the room shifted, conversations faltered, cameras flashed near the entrance, and Emma felt Oliver's body stiffen beside her. She turned to see a woman making her entrance as if the museum itself had been built to. Oh, frame her silhouette. Platinum blonde hair fell in perfect waves, her gown a sleek white sheath that clung to her like ice carved into flesh. The crowd parted around her, hungry for her presence. Patricia Wells. Emma knew her name without needing an introduction. She had read it once, whispered in the tabloids, linked to Oliver like an unfinished sentence. His ex-fiancée, the one who had almost become Mrs. Montague. Darling, Patricia cooed as she spotted Oliver, her smile sharp as glass. She glided across the marble like a swan with blood on its feathers. How wonderful to see you here. Then her gaze slid to Emma, one sweep, from the diamond earrings to the silk dress, and the smile twisted. And this must be the little waitress everyone's been talking about. The words were delivered sweetly enough that nearby guests chuckled, mistaking cruelty for wit. Emma's cheeks burned, but she forced her lips into a smile. Emma Sinclair, she said, extending her hand. Patricia took it as though handling a piece of lint. How charming. Oliver always did have a thing for charity cases. Emma's stomach dropped, but Oliver's face darkened with thunder. Patricia, that's enough. Oh, don't be so serious, darling, Patricia laughed, her voice ringing like breaking crystal. I'm just curious. Tell me, Emma, what's it like dating someone so far above your social class? It must be overwhelming. The words hit like daggers, and the crowd leaned in as though feeding on blood. Emma could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment curling around her like smoke. For a moment she wanted to disappear, to run back to the safety of greasy diners and Rose's tiny kitchen. But then she remembered Oliver's hand steady at her back, his eyes watching her with something raw and desperate. Emma drew in a slow breath. You're right, she said softly, her voice cutting through the hush like a blade. I don't belong in a world where people think their bank balance gives them the right to treat others like garbage. Gasps fluttered across the hall like startled birds. Patricia's smile cracked, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the jealousy beneath. Oliver's hand tightened on Emma's, pride burning in his gaze. But Emma couldn't stay. The room felt poisoned, the glittering lights suffocating. She turned, her dress whispering against the marble as she strode toward the museum steps. Behind her, she heard Oliver calling her name, his voice raw. She didn't stop. Out on the cold stone steps beneath the night sky, Emma finally let the tears fall. The fairy tale was unraveling. Cinderella had danced at the ball, but the glass slipper pinched too tightly. And when Oliver caught up with her, breathless and desperate, the choice that would shatter or save them both hung heavy in the Manhattan air. The museum's stone steps glistened faintly under the Manhattan night, the glow of street lamps casting long shadows across the temple-like facade. Emma's heels clicked against the marble as she fled, each step echoing louder than the gala's music spilling faintly behind her. The night air was cold against her flushed skin, and the emerald silk of her gown clung to her like chains. She had never felt so small in her life, dressed like royalty, but stripped bare in front of hundreds of eyes too. Hat saw her as nothing more than an interloper. Emma! Oliver's voice cut through the noise, commanding as always, but this time frayed with something raw. He was running after her. The billionaire who made grown men tremble in boardrooms, sprinting across the museum steps like a man chasing his last chance. She turned when she reached the bottom, tears hot in her eyes, her breath clouding in the night. Don't, Oliver, she said, her voice breaking. Don't follow me, I can't do this. He stopped a few feet away, his chest rising and falling beneath his perfectly tailored tuxedo. For once, his composure was shattered, his dark hair slightly mussed from the chase. His gray eyes, usually glacial, burned with desperation. Can't do what? He asked, his voice low but trembling. This. Emma gestured helplessly back toward the museum, to the glittering crowd that had watched Patricia tear her apart. Your world, the gossips, the cameras, the people who think I'm some kind of charity project you plucked out of the gutter. I don't fit there, Oliver, and pretending I do is going to break me and you into pieces. He took a step closer, then another. You fit with me, he said fiercely. That's all that matters. No, her voice wavered. It's not. Your life is boardrooms and galas and people like Patricia, people who see me as entertainment. I'm a waitress from Queens, Oliver. I work double shifts to pay for heart medication. You're a billionaire who commands empires. We don't live in the same universe." "You're right," Oliver said, his voice suddenly softer, almost breaking. "We don't live in the same universe, which is why I want to build one with you, just you and me." Emma's chest tightened. She shook her head, her tears spilling freely now. "That's not how the real world works. You can't just wish away the gap between us." Oliver's lips curved into a bitter smile. "Emma, I don't want someone who understands my world. I want someone who helps me escape it." His voice dropped to a whisper, and in the glow of the museum lights, his confession landed like a thunderclap. "I love you." The words hung in the air, fragile and terrifying. Emma froze, her pulse racing. She wanted to believe him, to let those words wrap around her like a shield against all the cruelty she had just endured. But doubt gnawed at her. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "You don't know what love looks like anymore. You only know power, control." "I know what it feels like to breathe for the first time in years." Oliver's voice cracked, his emotions spilling past his usual armor. "I know what it feels like to think about someone's laugh instead of quarterly reports, to want to protect instead of dominate. I know that with you, I'm not the Ice King. I'm just a man who wants to be worthy of you." He reached into his jacket pocket then, and the crowd of onlookers, gala guests who had drifted out in curiosity, gasped as Oliver Montague, the untouchable billionaire, sank down on one knee on the cold stone steps. The velvet box in his hand was small, understated. Inside, a single diamond gleamed, perfect but not ostentatious. But it wasn't the ring that silenced the night. It was the sight of Oliver Montague, kneeling like a supplicant, his storm-gray eyes lifted toward Emma with something close to fear. "Marry me, Emma," he said, his voice carrying into the stunned hush. "Not because I'm rich, not because I can buy you things, but because you make me a better man. Because I can't imagine a life without your honesty, your laughter, your courage. Because you see me when no one else does." Gasps rippled across the steps. Camera flashes exploded, capturing the Ice King undone. Patricia Wells stood at the top of the stairs, her perfect composure shattered, her fury written plain across her face. The society crowd whispered feverishly, some in awe, some in scorn, but none dared interrupt. Emma's hand trembled at her side. She looked down at Oliver, her heart torn between fear and a longing so fierce it nearly brought her to her knees too. "Oliver," she whispered, her voice breaking, "the prenup alone would be longer than a novel." "No prenup," he said instantly, his eyes blazing with conviction. "What's mine is yours. What's yours is mine. That's how marriage works." He smiled through the desperation. "Besides, I have a feeling you'll make me richer in all the ways that actually matter." Her breath hitched. She thought of Rosa knitting at home, of late nights laughing over cheap coffee, of Oliver showing up with medicine in his hands and panic in his eyes. She thought of the storm he was, and how somehow, impossibly, he had chosen to bend for her. And then Emma Sinclair, the waitress who once walked into the Golden Terrace terrified of losing her job, found herself nodding through her tears. "Yes," she said, voice trembling but fierce. "Yes, I'll marry you." The crowd erupted into applause. Oliver surged to his feet, slipping the ring onto her finger before pulling her into his arms, kissing her as though the world itself might break apart if he didn't. The flashes intensified, the whispers became headlines, and somewhere behind them, Patricia's fury turned her beauty into something monstrous. But Emma didn't care. In that moment there was no gala, no judgment, no world dividing them. There was only the man who had once been made of ice now melting into her arms. And as she clung to him under the lights of the museum, Emma realized the storm hadn't destroyed her. It had remade her. 6 months later, Manhattan buzzed with the kind of rumor that no press release could tame. Some whispered that Oliver Montague had gone soft, others that he had gone mad. The man once known as the Ice King had done the unthinkable. He had disappeared from the constant churn of cocktail parties and boardroom battles. But behind the velvet curtains of high society, a new story was quietly taking shape. It revealed itself one rainy afternoon when Sophia Chen, now dressed in something more casual than her usual razor-edged suits, stood before a newly painted sign in Queens, Rosa's table. She blinked up at it, hardly believing what she saw. Golden Terrace's most feared patron, the billionaire who once drove waiters to tears, had opened a restaurant here, far from Fifth Avenue, far from marble lobbies and champagne towers. And it wasn't for the rich, it was for families who couldn't afford fine dining but deserved to taste something extraordinary. Inside, the air was alive with a different kind of music. Children laughing, pans clattering, the smell of garlic and saffron and bread warm from the oven. The restaurant glowed with amber lights, but instead of intimidating chandeliers, there were strings of fairy lights looping across the ceiling. Instead of white-gloved waiters, volunteers and young staff moved with smiles, guided by a hospitality that came from the heart. At the center of it all, apron tied crookedly around his waist, was Oliver Montague himself, balancing 2 plates of food with awkward determination. He set them down at a table of 4, accepted a child's high five, and laughed. The Ice King, laughing in public, apron stained with sauce. It was unthinkable, and yet it was happening. Emma watched him from the kitchen pass through, her own hair tied back, her emerald eyes alight with pride. She had swapped silk gowns for chef whites, her hands dusted with flour, her face glowing from the heat of the ovens. She was no longer the waitress who walked on eggshells around wealthy diners. She was the heart of this new place, its pulse and vision. Rosa's table wasn't about dollar signs, it was about dignity. "Mija," Rosa called from her usual corner seat, surrounded by regulars already treating her like family. "You've done it. You've finally done it." Her needles clacked as she knitted and entertained 3 children with a story about Emma's first disastrous attempt at baking cookies. They laughed until orange soda sprayed across the table, and Rosa only chuckled louder. Suspense still lingered in the air, though. Not everyone was celebrating. Reporters camped outside, snapping photos, waiting for a scandal to prove this was a publicity stunt. Investors whispered in darkened boardrooms that Oliver had lost his edge. Patricia Wells, furious and scorned, fanned the flames at every party she attended, sneering that Rosa's table would collapse in a year. But Oliver was no longer the man who cared about whispers. He stood on the small platform at the front of the dining room that evening, tugging at his crooked apron, and raised a glass of lemonade. The crowd hushed. "I built empires once," he said, his voice carrying not with arrogance but with quiet conviction. "Skyscrapers, software, chains of restaurants and hotels, but they didn't make me feel alive. Not like this." He gestured to the families, the laughter, the simple joy that filled the air. His gaze found Emma's, and the storm gray of his eyes softened into something entirely human. "This is what matters. People. Love. Community. And it's because of Emma Sinclair and Rosa that I remembered what life is supposed to taste like." Applause thundered through the room, but it wasn't the polite clapping of galas. It was raw, heartfelt, from people who understood gratitude more than glamour. Later, when the last guests had left and only the golden glow of fairy lights remained, Emma wandered to the far wall of the restaurant, her breath caught. Mounted there was a gleaming plaque she hadn't seen before. She read it twice, heart pounding. "Rosa's Table, founded by Oliver Montague and Emma Sinclair, through Sinclair Holdings." "Sinclair Holdings?" she whispered, turning in disbelief. Oliver stood a few steps behind her, wiping his hands with a towel. He nodded almost shyly. "I renamed the parent company. Everything I build from here on out will carry your name, our name." Emma's throat tightened. "Oliver, that's right," he finished for her, his voice certain. "It's the only thing that's ever felt right." She threw her arms around him then, apron and all, and he held her close under the glow of the restaurant they had created together. Outside, the city kept spinning, ruthless as ever, but within these walls, love had carved out its own world. The waiters who once trembled at the sight of Oliver Montague now sat at the bar as guests, raising glasses to toast the impossible transformation. Sophia smiled through tears. Javier lifted his wine and murmured, "She didn't just tame the Ice King, she melted him." And as Emma looked into Oliver's eyes, no longer made of winter but of fire and devotion, she realized the truth Rosa had spoken long ago. Love makes its own world, and theirs was more powerful, more unshakable than any empire of stone or steel.